Elon Musk walked into a talk show, but by the end it was the host who found himself in the hot seat. The invitation arrived like any other, a simple email subject line inviting him to the Bryant Palmer show. Elon barely glanced at it at first. He received these requests from talk shows, news programs, and tech panels all the time, and most he declined. But Bryant Palmer was different. Palmer's show was one of the biggest on television, known for its blend of humor, controversy, and incisive interviews. Millions tuned in, not just for the guests, but for Palmer himself, the way he pushed boundaries, challenged ideas, and sometimes even humiliated his interviewees. Elon hesitated for a moment. His PR team had already vetted the request. "It's a good opportunity," his assistant had said. "Palmer reaches millions." Elon wasn't worried about exposure. He was curious. He knew Palmer's reputation, how he could turn an interview into a spectacle, how he thrived on making his guests uncomfortable. But Elon had never been one to back down from a challenge. So he agreed. The day arrived, and Elon found himself in a sleek, glass-walled studio in Los Angeles. The green room was quiet, filled with the low hum of distant conversations. A production assistant handed him a bottled water and then disappeared. He checked his watch. The interview was set to begin in 10 minutes. Across the room, a large screen played highlights from Palmer's past interviews. Clips of political leaders, Hollywood actors, and CEOs flashed by. Some laughing nervously, some arguing, others sitting stone-faced as Palmer toyed with them like a cat with a mouse. Elon smiled slightly. He knew what was coming. He'd been through enough interviews to recognize the pattern. Bait, provoke, wait for a reaction. The real question was, how far would Palmer push this time? A stagehand appeared at the door 5 minutes before showtime. "Mr. Musk," the assistant called, as Elon adjusted the sleeves of his black jacket. With the ease of a man who'd faced rockets exploding midair, factories failing, and financial meltdowns, he strode toward the stage. The studio was packed. Hundreds of people filled the seats. Some were die-hard fans, others skeptics, and a few had probably just come for the drama. The set was modern, a circular stage surrounded by bright LED panels, a large desk at the center with 2 chairs, one for Palmer, one for Musk. The host himself, Bryant Palmer, was already there, flipping through a stack of cue cards. As Elon approached, Palmer looked up and grinned his signature, practiced smile. "Elon," he said, standing up to shake his hand, "glad you could make it." Elon shook his hand firmly. They took their seats, and the audience hushed as the show's theme music played. Cameras rolled, and the stage lights dimmed, leaving only the 2 men in sharp focus. Palmer turned to the camera and flashed his smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest tonight. The man behind Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and a dozen other companies. I probably can't even pronounce half of them. The incomparable Elon Musk." The audience erupted in claps and cheers, mixed with a few murmurs. Palmer leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "So, Elon," he began smoothly, "people call you a genius, a visionary. Some say you're changing the world. Others think you're a complete lunatic. Which one is it?" Elon smiled faintly. "I think history will decide." Palmer tilted his head. "Fair enough. But let's talk about something a bit more interesting than just history, shall we?" His tone was playful yet sharp, and the audience sensed that this wouldn't be a friendly chat. Palmer leaned back, twirling a pen between his fingers. "Elon, you've built rockets, electric cars, and even implanted chips in monkey brains. Some would say you're playing God. What do you say to that?" Elon chuckled. "If I were playing God, I'd at least ensure my rockets didn't explode." The audience laughed, but Palmer wasn't done. "Right, but let's be real. You've got more money than entire countries, and people worship you like some sort of prophet. Do you ever wake up and think maybe you should slow down before turning into the next Bond villain?" A few chuckles and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elon nodded slowly. "I think if I were a Bond villain, I'd at least have a secret lair by now. Unfortunately, I still live in a $50,000 house in Texas." Laughter followed, though Palmer's delivery carried an edge that suggested he wasn't merely joking. Flipping through his cue cards, Palmer pressed on, "Ah, speaking of that house, Didn't you just fire most of the janitorial staff at X? Elon's expression remained unchanged. We had to make some adjustments, he replied calmly. Adjustments, Palmer echoed, his grin sharpening. That's an interesting way to say left people jobless right before the holidays. The audience murmured as the energy in the room shifted. Musk was used to tough questions, but this was different. Palmer wasn't merely probing, he was provoking. I assume you're talking about the San Francisco office? Elon asked evenly. Even, that's the one, Palmer said, leaning forward. Reports say people were crying. Elon, crying. You've got billions in the bank. Was that really necessary? Elon exhaled quietly. You know, running a company isn't about keeping everyone happy. It's about keeping it alive. X was losing $4 million a day. Palmer shrugged. Must be tough being a billionaire and making all those sacrifices. Nervous laughter and claps followed, but Musk didn't flinch. It's tough making a company work. There's a difference. Palmer tilted his head, sensing an opening, and gestured toward the crowd. You hear that, folks? Tough being the guy who owns private jets and sends cars to space. A few more chuckles and murmurs ensued. Musk let the moment linger, then leaned forward slightly. Do you want to have a real conversation, Bryant? Or are you just here to perform? The atmosphere tightened, the audience fell silent. Even Palmer blinked for a second before recovering, his signature smirk back in place. Oh, I love a good conversation, Elon. But I also love the truth. And the truth is, people say you're erratic, that you make reckless decisions. Twitter, sorry, X, has become a chaotic mess under your leadership. Elon raised an eyebrow. That's funny. It was losing billions before I took over, and now it's making a profit. Doesn't sound like chaos to me. Palmer smirked. Right. But let's talk about something people really care about. He turned to the audience. Raise your hand if you're a Tesla owner. A few hands went up. Nice. So you trust the self-driving feature? Cheers and hesitations mingled. Interesting, Palmer continued, addressing Elon. There have been crashes, lawsuits, even fatalities. Do you ever feel responsible when something goes wrong? Elon's fingers tapped lightly on the desk. Bryant, we could talk about any car company and find accidents. Has anyone asked Ford's CEO if he feels responsible when someone crashes a Mustang? Palmer chuckled. Fair, fair. But Ford's not promising full self-driving. You are. Elon smiled. Not yet, and neither are we. That's why it's still in beta. Palmer sighed theatrically. All right, let's move on to Neuralink brain chips. What happens when hackers break in, or when the government decides to turn people into robots? A few nervous laughs emerged. Musk stayed quiet for a moment, then said, You watch too many movies, Bryant. The audience laughed again, but Palmer wasn't backing down. Tapping his cue cards, his smirk widened. Come on, Elon. You can't tell me you don't see the risks. Putting chips in people's brains, automating every car, controlling internet satellites. At what point do we call it what it is? Power. Musk tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. You think I'm trying to control people? Palmer spread his hands. I think when one man has influence over social media, transportation, space travel, artificial intelligence, and now the human brain, it raises some questions. The audience murmured, some nodded, others looked uncertain. Musk let the moment hang, then said, I think people should ask questions. Skepticism is healthy. But the idea that I'm sitting there, rubbing my hands together, is a little ridiculous. Palmer chuckled. Well, you did name one of your AI projects. Ex Machina sounds ominous. Musk smiled faintly. It's actually XI, but close enough. Palmer waved it off. Okay, but let's talk about something you can't dismiss so easily. He turned to the audience. Raise your hand if you've heard about the lawsuit against Tesla for racial discrimination. A few hands went up, while others stayed still. Musk's jaw remained steady, but something shifted in his eyes. Palmer pressed on. There are reports of employees facing slurs, discrimination, unsafe work environments. How does the guy who wants to take humanity to Mars let this happen here on Earth? A few murmurs rippled through the audience, as some leaned forward to watch closely. Musk's voice stayed calm. You're talking about an issue that affects every major company in America. When we find problems, we take action. Palmer scoffed. So you're saying it's just business as usual? Elon exhaled softly. I'm saying it's not unique to Tesla, and it's not something we ignore. But if you want to talk about lawsuits, let's talk about your network. For a split second, Palmer blinked. Excuse me? Leaning forward, Musk continued. You work for a network that's been sued for pushing false information. You sit in that chair, call out corporate greed, yet your show runs ads from pharmaceutical companies, billion-dollar banks, and defense contractors. The audience stirred. This was no longer the usual back-and-forth banter. Palmer chuckled, but it was a thinner sound now. Nice deflection, but I'm not the one, he began. Musk cut him off. You're not the one making billion-dollar deals behind closed doors. You're not the one taking orders from executives on what stories to air. You're not the one profiting off division. A heavy silence fell. Palmer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Musk continued calmly. You want to talk about power? Let's talk about yours. You sit here pretending to be the voice of the people, yet your paycheck comes from the same corporations you claim to call out. And the moment you push too hard in one direction, you're out of a job. Some in the audience clapped, others just stared. Palmer forced a chuckle. So now you're flipping this on me? He asked. Musk shrugged. I thought you liked the truth, Bryant. For the first time that night, Palmer had no quick comeback. He shuffled his cue cards, trying to regain control, but Musk sat back and watched him. The power had clearly shifted. The host cleared his throat, attempting to regain his rhythm. All right, he said, forcing a grin. You got your shot in. But let's be real, Elon. You love playing the underdog, the misunderstood genius, the rogue billionaire fighting against the system. Leaning forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially, Palmer added, But isn't that just branding? A man worth nearly $200 billion isn't exactly fighting the system. You are the system. Musk tilted his head slightly. Am I? Of course you are. Palmer continued, You're the richest man in the world. You buy companies when they annoy you. You joke about free speech. But let's be honest. You run X like it's your personal playground. You decide who gets to speak and who gets silenced. Musk's expression remained calm, though the energy in the room shifted even further. Palmer wasn't finished. And let's not forget, you're friends with some very influential people. You and Peter Thiel, you and Saudi investors. Would you like to talk about your friends? In a quiet, steady voice, Musk replied, The people who fund your show, the executives who decide your airtime, the political donors. When I make a decision, people know exactly where it's coming from. Can you say the same? Palmer opened his mouth again, then closed it. Musk pressed on. I build things. People see them. They work or they don't. When I fail, the whole world sees it. But you sit here, pretending to challenge the powerful while taking notes backstage. For a split second, Palmer's face twitched. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Some nodded, a few clapped. Palmer's control was slipping. You're dodging the question, Palmer quickly interjected. This isn't about me, it's about you. They say you're erratic, that you push dangerous ideas, that your employees are terrified. Do you even care about the consequences? Musk leaned forward just slightly. Do you? He countered. You make your living stirring outrage. You don't solve problems. You don't build anything. When the cameras stop rolling, when the controversy dies down, what have you actually done? Palmer shifted in his seat. Musk continued, I get it. Your job is to get people angry, to entertain, to keep the ad revenue flowing. But don't confuse that with actually making a difference. A few claps, a few nods. Palmer ran a hand through his hair, laughing tightly. Well, folks, he said, I think we just got a masterclass in deflection. Musk smiled, and the applause was more genuine this time. Palmer glanced at the producers off stage. They were watching closely. His control over the interview had clearly slipped, and Musk knew it. The tension was palpable. Palmer adjusted his tie, trying to force a grin, but something in the air had changed. The confidence he'd walked in with was evaporating. The audience was no longer laughing. Some leaned forward intently, others exchanged glances, uncertain of what they were witnessing. In a final attempt to regain control, Palmer cleared his throat and said, "All right, Elon, you came here to talk about innovation and the future. Let's end on a positive note. What's next? What's the next big Musk project that's going to save humanity?" It was a weak attempt at regaining control. Musk leaned back slightly, considering the question. "There are a lot of things in motion," he said finally. "Advancing AI, space travel, sustainable energy. But I think the biggest challenge isn't technology. It's trust." Palmer raised an eyebrow. "Trust?" Musk nodded. "People don't trust institutions anymore. They don't trust governments, the media, corporations, and often, for good reason." A murmur ran through the crowd. Palmer gave a tight chuckle. "And you think you're the solution?" "No." Musk shook his head. "I think honesty is. I think people are tired of being manipulated." Palmer scoffed. "So what, you're saying I'm the problem now?" Musk tilted his head slightly. "I'm saying you're part of an industry that profits from keeping people divided, outraged, distracted. You ask if I feel responsible for what I create, do you?" For a split second, Palmer had no answer. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Then someone in the audience clapped, and another, until applause slowly built. Palmer's jaw tightened as he forced another smile. "Well," he said, shifting in his chair, "this has certainly been an interesting conversation." Musk nodded. "I'd say so." The studio lights burned hot as the cameras continued rolling. Palmer licked his lips, then forced himself to move on. "All right, folks, give it up for Elon Musk." A mix of applause and murmurs filled the room. Musk stood, shook Palmer's hand, and walked off stage, leaving the host still trying to process what had just happened. But the real storm was only beginning. As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, the tension in the studio didn't fade. It thickened. The usual post-show chatter was muted. Producers, assistants, and camera operators moved with a rare quietness. Palmer ripped off his earpiece and tossed it onto the desk. His face was still plastered with a forced grin, but his eyes darted toward his producer. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath. The producer didn't answer. He was too busy staring at his phone. Half the studio was in the same state. It had taken less than 5 minutes for the interview to go viral. Someone in the audience had been recording. Clips flooded social media. Twitter, or rather X, was on fire. Headlines practically wrote themselves. Elon Musk turns the tables on Bryant Palmer, calls out media hypocrisy, live on TV. Backstage, as Musk stepped into a waiting Tesla, his phone vibrated nonstop. His mentions were skyrocketing. One clip posted by an account with just a few thousand followers already had hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in. Elon had taken Palmer apart like an engineer dismantling a faulty prototype. This wasn't an interview. It was an execution. Palmer wasn't ready for this at all. Then came the think pieces, the debates, the analysis. Some hailed Musk's response as brilliant. Others called it arrogant. Some argued Palmer had walked right into his own trap, while others contended that Musk had dodged real accountability by flipping the script. But one thing was undeniable. People weren't talking about Palmer's questions. They were talking about Musk's answers. Palmer stormed into his dressing room, slamming the door behind him. His producer followed, speaking carefully. "Listen, we need to be ready for how this is going to play out." Palmer scoffed, pouring himself a drink. "Oh, I know how it's going to play out. The internet's going to eat this up. Musk fanboys are going to act like he walked on water. And I'm going to be painted as the biased journalist who got owned." He shook his head. The guy literally dodged every question. The producer hesitated. Did he, though? Palmer's jaw tightened. The producer sighed. "The thing is, Bryant, people don't like feeling manipulated, and tonight, you kind of looked like you were manipulating." Palmer's grip tightened on his glass as the producer glanced at his phone again. "We need to get ahead of this." Palmer exhaled sharply. "Yeah, and what do you suggest? Damage control?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You want me to apologize? Not happening." The producer shook his head. "Not an apology, a reframing. We spin it. Say Musk was deflecting, that he couldn't handle real scrutiny. that he proved he's just as thin-skinned as the people he criticizes. Palmer narrowed his eyes, considering it. But before he could answer, there was a knock at the door. An assistant peeked in, looking nervous. "Bryant," she said carefully, "the network wants a meeting now." Across town, Musk was sitting in a quiet office, sipping coffee as he read the headlines. His team had already compiled the data: engagement spikes, media reactions, sentiment tracking. He barely paid attention to it. Instead, he scrolled through a simple post on X from the night before. It wasn't from a journalist or a political pundit. It was from a regular viewer who summed up the interview in a single sentence. The scariest thing about last night wasn't what Musk said. It was realizing how badly the media wants to control the story. Musk smiled slightly and set his phone down. He knew this moment wouldn't last forever, but it didn't have to. All it took was one crack in the facade, one moment when people saw the strings being pulled. And once you see the strings, you never watch the puppet show the same way again. The real lesson wasn't about Elon Musk or Bryant Palmer. It wasn't about who won or lost the interview. It was about perception. Media figures like Palmer had built their careers on controlling narratives, shaping public opinion, and deciding what was newsworthy. But for the first time in a long while, the audience saw through it all. And that's what truly mattered. In a world awash with information, real power doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who truly learn to listen. What do you think? Was this just another viral moment, or was it something bigger? Drop a comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe for more, because the conversations that actually matter are just getting started.